Hello everyone, Professor V here, and welcome to my virtual classroom. Now, we are going to be going over some crucial material. The first lecture is going to be an introduction to the material that we will cover this semester and the methodology of research within the study of psychopathology. So, who's ready for an adventure? No, not really. It's pretty boring stuff if you ask me. But hey, gotta know it not only for the exam, but to be successful in the psychology field. So, roll that intro. So the first topic is defining abnormal behavior. Now, I'm still not too sure what normal behavior is. So, defining abnormal behavior is a bit, I don't know, abnormal? Anywho, there are various criteria used to define abnormal behavior. Psychologists generally consider behavior abnormal when it meets some combination of the following criteria. 1. Unusual or infrequent. 2. Socially unacceptable or in violation of social norms. 3. Fraught with misperceptions or misinterpretations of reality. 4. Associated with states of severe personal distress. 5. Maladaptive or self-defeating. And 6. Dangerous. Well, doesn't that mean normal behaviors is the opposite of that? Debatable, I guess. So, a psychological disorder consists of abnormal behaviors. It can be a state of severe distress, such as depression or anxiety, or with impaired behavior or the inability to function properly, such as difficulty holding a job or distinguishing reality from fantasy. The branch of psychology that studies psychological disorders, describes them, determines causes, and how to treat them is abnormal psychology.
I'd never thought I'd see a psychologist or someone like that, you know. I'm a police photographer, and I've shot some pretty grisly stuff, corpses and all. Crime scenes are not like what you see on TV. They're more grisly. I guess you sort of get used to it. It never bothered me, just maybe at first. Before I did this job, I worked on a TV news chopper. We would take shots of fires and rescues, you know. Now I get uptight sitting in the back seat of a car or riding an elevator. I'll avoid taking an elevator unless I really have no other choice. Forget flying anymore. It's not just helicopters. I just won't go in a plane, any kind of plane. I guess I was younger then and more daring when I was younger. Sometimes I would hang out of the helicopter to shoot pictures with no fear at all. Now, just thinking about flying makes my heart race. It's not that I'm afraid the plane will crash. That's the funny thing. Not ha-ha funny, but peculiar, you know. I just start trembling when I think of them closing that door, trapping us inside. I can't tell you why.
A psychological disorder is a pattern of abnormal behavior that is associated with states of significant emotional distress, such as anxiety or depression, or with impaired behavior or ability to function, such as difficulty holding a job or even distinguishing reality from fantasy. Abnormal psychology is the branch of psychology that studies abnormal behavior and ways of helping people who are affected by psychological disorders.
As stated before, this list is commonly used by psychologists to determine abnormal behaviors. However, the list is a bit vague. Let's take a look at each. Unusualness is any behavior that is unusual or just doesn't seem quite right. Seeing and hearing things that are not actually there are almost always considered abnormal in our culture and many others. But such experiences are sometimes considered normal in certain types of spiritual or religious experiences. When people state that God or Jesus spoke to them, they are not necessarily hearing someone speak words into their ear. They mean it more as God or Jesus giving them a sign. And this sign isn't indicative of them seeing things either. They don't necessarily mean that God or Jesus appeared to them in a humanoid form directly in front of them. They could mean it as a natural sign in their environment that God or Jesus puts in front of them. However, if they did mean it like that, in some religious beliefs or even cultures, that isn't considered abnormal. The majority of people do not experience anxiety or excessive worryfulness. However, for those who do experience anxiety upon entering a crowded building, such as a mall or maybe an amusement park on a holiday weekend, may be considered abnormal because for most, they don't experience these symptoms. But what about people who excel at particular tasks? Are they abnormal because the majority of people cannot perform the task as well as them? In the US, only 32% of the population aged 25 and over have obtained a bachelor's degree. Only 12% of the population aged 25 and over have obtained a master's degree or higher. And only 2% aged 25 and over have obtained a doctorate degree. When you graduate from college, does that make you abnormal? Am I abnormal? Well, the point is, just because you belong to a population that isn't the majority does not make you abnormal. Rarity or statistical deviance is not a sufficient basis for labeling behavior. Nevertheless, it is just often just used to measure or judge abnormality. Social deviance. All societies have norms or standards on which behaviors are accepted in certain situations, environments, or contexts. Behavior that is deemed normal in one culture may be viewed as abnormal by another. Take hand holding. When we hold hands in the US, it is seen that the two are in a relationship. When we see two men or two women holding hands, we also assume they are in a relationship. But if we were to take a trip to India, we would also see the same thing, people holding hands. However, it is more common to see two men holding hands who are not in a relationship or even homosexual for that matter. In India, holding hands is considered a way of showing affection and bonding and camaraderie. In the US, we automatically assume two men or two women holding hands to be homosexuals. We look at it differently. Thus, clinicians need to weigh cultural differences in determining abnormality. Time also affects what is considered abnormal behaviors. Again, let's discuss homosexuality. Homosexuality was once considered a psychiatric disorder, but by the mid-1970s, this began to change. Today, homosexuality is not labeled in the DSM and not considered a mental disorder, and many people argue that homosexuality should be included as a normal variation of behavior. However, there are still plenty of people who do not. And just because some behaviors we do not approve of does not mean that the person is sick or has some type of mental illness. People still label them as so, though. Perhaps it's a Freudian defense mechanism, which we will discuss those later. Faulty perceptions, like hallucinations such as seeing things, or people that are not there, or hearing voices from others that are not present, are not considered normal. Delusions, such as the delusion of persecution, such as believing the police are after you when they are not, is also not considered normal or experienced by the majority. We discussed this partly already earlier when discussing religion. States of personal distress caused by anxiety, fear, or depression may be abnormal. However, there are times where it is seen as normal behavior, such as becoming sad or depressed when a loved one passes away. In cases like this, it may seem abnormal not to have these feelings. These feelings, anxiety, fear, and depression, are considered abnormal if they persist long after the source of the feelings and the cause of the feeling occurred, or if they are so intense that it disrupts a daily functioning. Maladaptive or self-defeating behaviors is behavior performed by someone that leads to unhappiness rather than self-fulfillment. This is considered abnormal. Behavior that limits a person's ability to perform in their expected roles, such as jobs or parenting, or adapt to their environments, may also be considered abnormal. Think about this. We all know that alcohol impairs our cognition or our ability to think clearly, yet there are plenty of people who drink too much on a daily basis. They know they need to slow down or quit altogether. Better to just quit, right? They wake up late, have hangovers, go to work hungover, and can't perform at their job, and a various amounts of other negative things are impacted by alcohol use, yet they continue to drink. This is a self-defeating behavior and is considered abnormal, and this person will be labeled as an alcoholic. Damn it, I guess I gotta put this down now. And dangerousness. These are behaviors that people partake in that are dangerous to oneself or to others. As like before, social context is crucial. As one who charges at a car on fire to rescue the people inside the burning car is considered a hero, even though that was a very dangerous behavior. There are others that threaten suicide or killing others in a violent act. This is considered abnormal. So we can see that abnormal behavior may be more difficult to define than initially thought. We must take into account the situation, environment, time, culture, and a whole range of other aspects before we can define a behavior as abnormal.
Mental disorders vary greatly in how they affect the individuals who have them and how they might appear to an outsider. They may be so mild as to be almost unnoticeable, or so severe that they affect an individual's ability to function normally. Because of this variability, and because mental disorders are difficult to see, they remain shrouded in mystery for many people. So, let's start with what we know and what we aren't sure about. How would you define mental disorders? What causes them? Are they influenced most by how we are raised or by our genes? How treatable or curable are mental disorders?
A mental disorder is typically defined as being a behavioral or psychological symptom or pattern that's associated with significant amounts of distress or disability. And particularly, we think about this in terms of impaired functioning in their normal social lives or professional lives. And it's important to note that any context that we want to discuss a mental disorder in is going to be relative, right? So there are different norms by each culture, for each society, depending on where you live. Certain things are normal, other things are not normal. So the context is always important when evaluating anything we want to say is normal or abnormal. But in general, we know that psychological distress and impaired functioning is a key feature of most mental disorders. In general, we can't say that anything in particular causes mental disorders. So what we think about now is more risk factors and what might leave people more predisposed. And there are three categories of factors that may contribute to these risk factors. They're biological, psychological, and sociocultural. It's tough to say whether something could really be preventable in that we don't really fully understand the true root cause of a mental disorder. We know that certain individuals may be less predisposed than others. People develop things like resilience or certain other types of coping mechanisms that allow them to perhaps cope better with certain adverse events in life and thus be less likely to exhibit signs of mental disorders. But certainly there are a rich array of treatment options available for just about every disorder. And so individuals should also know that if one particular type of treatment option doesn't work for them, it doesn't mean that they can't be treated. It means there are other options and maybe something else would be a better fit for them. A different style of therapy, a different therapist, perhaps a different type of drug treatment. So we do have a lot of different options in our arsenal for treating mental disorders. As far as saying whether or not something's curable, again, it really depends. It depends on how well the individual adapts and takes those skills that they may learn in therapy and is able to use them later in life and draw on them to cope with other adverse events that they may experience. So again, there's no one right or wrong or saying something's curable or not. It really depends on the individual and on the disorder. We know that genes do play a role in certain mental disorders, but it's tough at this point to understand fully what the role of genes are versus our environment versus the other experiences that we have. So for certain conditions like depression or schizophrenia, we know that there are genetic links. We know that the odds are slightly higher for individuals who have parents with any of those disorders. We don't know exactly what might lead one individual with that genetic history to exhibit signs of depression versus another, but we do know that there's a predisposition or a risk factor there. As we start to understand better the role of genetics in risk factors for these mental disorders, the better equipped we'll be to help individuals with potential risk factors develop appropriate coping mechanisms. An individual's upbringing can certainly play a role in how likely they are to exhibit mental disorders at later stages. We know, for instance, that children who are raised in homes where there's a lot of marital discord wind up showing more signs of aggression towards their peers. They can wind up being bullies. So certainly we see our parents and we model that behavior. We learn from our environment. That's not to say, again, though, that we're inevitably destined to act just like our parents did. As adults, we can be aware of those patterns or those predispositions or habits, and we can take steps to change them and address them proactively. Well, it's hard to say something is normal or not normal because normal is really a relative term, right? What's normal in New York City certainly wouldn't be considered normal in many cases if we look at Omaha, Nebraska. But from a psychological perspective, when we talk about what's normal behavior, we're really referring to healthy adaptive functioning, both at a professional and personal level. So does the person have a healthy degree of relationships with their peers, with others in their environment, with family, friends? Are they able to, go to classes or go to their job and perform at a reliable, consistent level day in and day out? And as far as normal, also the most important thing is what's normal to you. So you know yourself certainly better than anyone else does. And if you start to notice that, for instance, every day you're feeling a little bit down or you don't have interest in doing things that you used to like to do, you don't really want to see your friends anymore, or everything starts to feel like hopeless or sad, then for you, that's not normal, and you know that, and that might be an appropriate time to consider talking to a professional.
It's clear that many of us have questions and concerns about mental disorders. Do you think someone you know has a disorder? Do you worry that you might? And if so, what are the options? Fortunately, thanks to a great deal of research, there are many good answers to the questions you might have, and many good therapy options available. We'll be exploring the diagnosis and treatment of disorders and explaining how to find help if you need it.
Now let's take a look into the history of the study and the treatment of psychological disorders and abnormal behaviors. Many ancient societies attributed abnormal behavior to divine or supernatural forces. They believed that this behavior was caused by the inhabitation of evil spirits, and it was treated by manually drilling holes into people's skulls to release the spirit or demon that possessed them. This was called trephination. Many skulls that were found showed fresh bone growth, suggesting that many survived this process. And remember, there was no anesthetics back then either. Yikes. Now, there still isn't proof that trephination was performed because of demonic possession, because no written record exists for the purpose of trephining. It could have been used for another purpose. There is no way to be absolutely certain. However, this notion of supernatural causes of abnormal behavior persisted throughout Western society until the Age of Enlightenment. Pretty scary, huh? In ancient Greece, the philosopher Hippocrates. What the f? Hippocrates believed that abnormal behaviors reflected natural causes. He believed that the body had an imbalance of one or more of four humors or bodily fluids of the body. These consisted of phlegm, black bile, blood, and yellow bile. Too much phlegm, the person was lethargic or sluggish. Too much black bile was thought to cause depression. Excess amounts of blood created a sanguine disposition, meaning the person was cheerful, confident, and optimistic. And an above average amount of yellow bile was thought to cause a person to be quick-tempered. Now, of course, this has been debunked. However, it served a greater purpose. This was the first time that psychological disorders were thought to stem from biological processes. In medieval times in Western societies, it was still believed that abnormal behaviors were due to possession by evil spirits. The Catholic Church taught and reinforced these ideologies and offered exorcisms as treatments. Now, we've all seen the Exorcist movie. The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you. Put the devil behind you, my son. Put the devil behind you. No, demonic possession and exorcism were not like that at all. But Professor V, it's based on a true story. Exactly. It's based on a true story. It's not a true story. I bet 90% of that movie didn't even occur. Sheesh. However, exorcism did use prayer, incantations, or the use of spells, waving a cross at the victim. Some did get violent, and including beating and even starving the victim. From the late 15th to late 17th century, there were many persecutions of women believed to be witches and supposedly performed satanic rituals to summon the devil and its demons. However, modern scholars believe these so-called witches were actually people with psychological disorders who were persecuted and even executed because of their abnormal behaviors. By the late 15th and early 16th century, mental asylums started to appear throughout Europe. Conditions in these asylums were dreadful, and in some, such as the Bethlehem Hospital in England, a circus atmosphere prevailed. With the rise of moral therapy in the 19th century, largely spearheaded by the Frenchmen Jean-Baptiste Bussine and Philippe Pinel, conditions in these mental hospitals improved. So with Bussine and Pinel spearheading the reform movement and arguing for more moral therapeutic techniques to be used, again conditions improved, and many supported Bussine and Pinel. Proponents of moral therapy believed that mental patients could be restored to functioning if they were treated with dignity and understanding. Dorothy Dix, a proponent of moral therapy in the US in the 1800s, traveled all over the country speaking about the horrific conditions in jails and almshouses. And as a result of her speaking out, 32 mental hospitals were established in the United States. However, a decline of moral therapy in the latter part of the 19th century led to a period of apathy and to the belief that the insane could not be successfully treated. Conditions in mental hospitals deteriorated, and the hospitals offered little more than custodial care. In the middle of the 20th century, public outrage and concern about the plight of mental patients mobilized legislative efforts toward the development of community mental health centers as alternatives to long-term hospitalization. This movement toward deinstitutionalization was spurred by the introduction of psychoactive drugs called phenothiazines, which curbed the more flagrant features of schizophrenia. So in 1963, Congress established a nationwide system of community mental health centers. They were to support mental institutions and aid former hospital residents by creating community-based care and structured residential treatment settings such as halfway houses. While this seems like a great alternative to mental health care, it has not lived up to the expectations, with many discharged patients left in inadequate housing and lacking other forms of support they needed to function. Many mental health patients roam the streets, homeless. There has been some success, but there are still many patients whose mental health problems fail to receive the services they need. CMHCs, community mental health centers, are severely underfunded and unable to reach many of the people that need its services. If deinstitutionalization is going to work, patients need continuing care and opportunities for decent housing, gainful employment, and training in social and vocational skills. With today's state hospitals generally more focused on medication and psychiatry, it's an improvement, but still, outpatient mental health care has a long way to go. Switching topics to contemporary perspective of abnormal behavior. There are four main contemporary views on abnormal behavior. Two are listed here, the biological and the psychological perspectives. The biological model explains abnormal behavior in terms of biological defects or abnormalities and disorders can be classified according to distinctive causes and symptoms. As stated earlier, Hippocrates stated a biological influence on behavior. While his theory on the imbalances of four humors were false, it was the first time that behavior was thought to have a biological basis. And he was right about that part, even though it wasn't really studied scientifically until the 18 and 1900s. There is a load of different chemicals called neurotransmitters in the brain, and when there is an imbalance of these neurotransmitters, abnormal behaviors such as depression and mania can occur. Damage to certain areas of the brain from traumatic brain injuries and strokes can also lead to abnormal behaviors. Several diseases can also lead to abnormal behaviors if gone untreated, such as syphilis, which can cause general paresis. General paresis is associated with physical symptoms and psychological impairments, including personality and mood changes, and with progressive deterioration of memory functioning, and judgment. The discovery of the cure for syphilis led to an optimism that biological causes for other types of disturbed behavior would be discovered. Alzheimer's disease, also a brain disease, which is a major cause of dementia, lent further support to the biological perspectives of psychology. The psychological perspective focuses on psychological roots of abnormal behavior and includes psychoanalytic, behavioral, humanistic, and cognitive models. Sigmund Freud was the first major influential person in developing the psychodynamic model, the first major psychological model of abnormal behavior. He believed that the unconscious mind had more influence of our daily behaviors than we realized, and the causes of psychological problems lied outside of conscious awareness. He would use hypnosis to discover with his patients built up emotions and allow them to discharge them. The last two are sociocultural and biopsychosocial perspectives. The sociocultural perspective examines the broader social context in which abnormal behavior occurs. Sociocultural theorists believe that abnormal behavior is caused by social ills and failures of society rather than the person themselves. This can be due to unemployment, poverty, family breakdown, injustice, ignorance, and lack of opportunity. Think about it. Any of those things could cause depression or anxiety. With unemployment and poverty, someone may not know if they will be able to eat that day or feed their children. This can be very debilitating for many. Injustice can cause various amounts of mental health issues, such as depression as well. Think about all the recent news stories of people getting away with murder. Granted, the prosecution attorneys failed to present enough evidence, such as Trayvon Martin, and more recently, Josue Flores and John Hernandez. Martin's killer was set free. All charges against Flores' killer were dropped a few weeks ago, while Hernandez's case is still up in the air, at least at the time of me recording this lecture in mid-July. Knowing that there is no justice can also be debilitating and could cause anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts or attempts. Now, I don't want to come across as being antagonistic towards the court system, as I do believe in the court system to prove those who are guilty as guilty and assume that people are innocent until proven guilty. But I just want to point out the fact that the Martin family had no closure to Trayvon's death, which can be hard for the entire family, friends, and in this case, the entire black community. Same for the Flores and Hernandez cases. And lastly, the biopsychosocial model. This perspective is an interactionist model, and abnormal behavior is viewed as the result of the interplay of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. This takes the previous three perspectives and lumps them together as interacting with one another to describe abnormal behavior. It's rarely just one factor that influences abnormal behavior. It's usually a combination of the three.
There are many different types of disorders and a number of ways in which psychologists go about understanding and treating them. Four of the most common types of mental disorders are anxiety disorders, mood disorders, autism spectrum disorders, and schizophrenia. Psychologists look at biological, psychological, and social factors when studying and treating these conditions.
Major depression is a disorder that can be described as a person who experiences persistent low mood and affects that person's ability to function normally. Biological component of depression has to do with disruption of sleep. So this could be not having enough sleep, which is insomnia, or sleeping too much, or disruption of one's appetite, affecting that person in terms of gaining too much weight or having weight loss. Psychological component. A person may feel sadness, hopelessness, or thinking negatively or pessimistically. The social component. Lack of interest in the things that one normally enjoys, and also withdrawing from friends and other social activities.
You're absolutely alone. You feel you are alone. You feel absolute worthlessness. You feel that there's no hope in the future. You believe everything is dissolving. You feel your marriage may be dissolving, relationships with children may be dissolving, all this kind of thing.
Anxiety disorders is a group of disorders that's characterized by three general categories of symptoms. The first being having physical symptoms of anxiety or fear. The second, unrealistic anxiety or cognitive distress. Third, escape or avoidance behaviors. Anxiety disorders can be described in the following three components. Biological. Some of the symptoms can be having racing heart rate, increased blood pressure, or muscle tension, what we normally think of as stress, or nausea, for example. Psychological component. Worrying that's out of proportion to the situation. Generalized anxiety that gets in the way of one's normal functioning. Social component. Fear or being afraid to be around other people and other impairments in various social situations.
I imagine that people are watching me. They're watching me stumble in my efforts to articulate. And typically I'm very articulate. But in that setting, I can be almost rendered mute.
Schizophrenia is a severe psychological disorder that can be described by a person who has disorganized thinking, perceives things differently, and behaves differently. In terms of the biological component, a person may have lowered or diminished facial expression, or sometimes their facial expressions might seem frozen. They may speak in a very monotone vocal tone or a monotone voice, and some of their physical movements or gestures might be repetitive and unusual. Psychological component. A person may experience delusions, which means abnormal thinking or beliefs about something. Hallucinations, which means seeing or hearing things that they normally shouldn't be seeing or hearing. Paranoid thinking, thinking about things that actually aren't real. Disorganized thoughts and speech patterns, where it's hard to connect the dots from topic A to topic B to topic C. Social component, impaired ability to identify emotional states of other people. That is, they have a difficult time reading other people's emotions. And oftentimes for themselves, they may show inappropriate emotional responses, or sometimes the lack of emotional responses, which is often called flat affect.
Paranoid schizophrenia.
Okay. And can you tell me what are some of the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia that you are suffering from?
Occasionally I hear voices in my head.
Okay. What kind of voices are they? Can you tell me about the voices?
You know, I have all kinds of companions, some fictional and some non-fictional. I had lost all contact with reality. When I don't take my medication, I kind of lose contact with reality.
In what way?
I mean, I start having delusional thinking.
Autism spectrum disorder. This is a group of disorders consisting of autism, Asperger's syndrome, and other developmental disorders. Combinations and severity of symptoms vary amongst individuals. The biological component. Person may experience abnormal neurological development, or sensitivity, unusual reactions to sounds, smells, tastes, or sights. Psychological component. Repetitive or obsessive behaviors, inflexible adherence to routines or rituals. Social component. Impairment in using spoken and nonverbal communication, meaning that they do not speak and use hand gestures the way most people might. Impaired ability to understand other people's feelings, so in this case they would have a difficult time reading what other people are expressing emotionally.
You don't know what they're really capable of. They continuously surprise you.
Right. You weren't sure he'd ever talk, and now he's talking. You
Yep,
don't know if he'll be able to learn more.
Yeah, he he can work the DVD player better than I can. And he can zoom in. He knows how to. He figures all that stuff out to so he's able to entertain himself. But you just you never know with spectrum disorder, and it's just very it's difficult, and you have to understand that people have to go through a process when they hear the diagnosis. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. They just assume, you know what it is now, so just deal with it. And it's not that easy.
Moving on to research methods. I know this is what you've been waiting for this entire lecture, huh? The scientific approach focuses on 4 general objectives: description, explanation, prediction, and control. There is a great little exercise to help with the identification of these 4 major objectives on page 21 of your textbooks. I suggest you take a look at it carefully. There are 4 steps to the scientific method: formulating a research question, framing the research question in the form of a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, and drawing conclusions about the correctness of the hypothesis. In many textbooks, they'll also describe a 5th step: reporting the results, the significant results of your studies. To form their research question, scientists look at previous research, observations, and current theories of behavior that may support their question. Next, they form the question into a hypothesis. A hypothesis is often referred to as an educated guess, with guess being the dominant word heard. A hypothesis is not just a guess. A hypothesis is a guess that you have based on previous scientific research. Because of the previous research, you expect your own research to turn out in a certain way, this being your hypothesis. Next is to test the hypothesis scientifically. This means using different variables: independent variables, dependent variables, criterion variables, predictor variables, and eliminating other causes or variables for the behavior studied. Lastly, scientists then draw conclusions about the hypothesis after analyzing the data obtained from testing the hypothesis. Psychologists follow the ethical principles that govern research with human and non-human subjects. Two of the key ethical provisions guiding research with human participants are informed consent and confidentiality. Informed consent requires that people be free to choose whether to participate in research studies. They are also informed that they are allowed to withdraw whenever they want. They are given sufficient information in advance about the study's methods, what they will be asked to do, and any risks that may be involved. This way, they are given enough information to choose if they want to participate or not. Research participants also have a right to their own privacy. They expect their identities not to be revealed, and researchers are required to protect their confidentiality by keeping records of their participation secure and not disclosing their identities to others. Research samples need to be representative of the target population. The naturalistic observation method allows scientists to measure behavior under naturally occurring conditions. It is incredibly important to be unobtrusive or not interfere with the participants or subjects. However, if a person or subject notices a researcher is observing them, it is highly likely that they will begin to act different. Think about it. Don't you act different when you know people are watching? Well, you do in most situations. This type of research reveals how people or animals behave, but it does not reveal as to why they behave the way they do. They determine why. You must use controlled experiments. Correlational research explores the relationship between variables, which may help predict future behavior and suggest possible underlying causes of behavior. But correlational research does not directly test cause and effect relationships. Longitudinal research is a type of correlational design that involves the study of selected subjects at periodic intervals over long periods, sometimes spanning decades. In the experimental method, the investigator directly controls or manipulates the independent variable under controlled conditions in order to demonstrate cause and effect relationships. They incorporate independent variables, or IVs, and dependent variables, or DVs. They use these variables to test their hypotheses. IVs are factors that are under the control and manipulated by the experimenter. DVs are factors that are observed in order to determine the effects of manipulating the independent variables. They are measured, not manipulated. In experiments, participants are exposed to the IV. Then they are observed to see if the IV makes a difference in their behavior. More precisely, to see if the IV affects the DV. The book uses a great example of alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks. The IV would be the type of beverage, and the investigators observe if the participants act more aggressively when drinking alcohol. Aggressiveness would be the DV. The next slide shows a further breakdown on the differences of IVs and DVs. In the experimental method, the investigator directly controls or manipulates the independent variable under controlled conditions in order to demonstrate cause and effect relationships. Experiments uses random assignments as the basis for determining which subjects, the experimental subjects, receive an experimental treatment and which others, called control subjects, do not. If random selection isn't used, there is a high chance of selection factor. This meaning that the cause of change in the behavior is not due to the IV, but the type of participants instead. As researchers, we must avoid this to happen. Researchers use various methods including single-blind placebo-controlled studies, double-blind placebo-controlled studies, and attention placebo-controlled studies to attempt to control for subjects and researchers' expectations. Experiments are evaluated in terms of their experimental validity. Internal validity refers to the ability of an experimental study to justify a cause and effect relationship between the independent and dependent variables. Internally valid studies control for possible confounds or rival hypotheses. External validity refers to the degree to which experimental results can be generalized to other subjects, settings, and even times. Construct validity refers to the degree to which treatment effects can be accounted for by the theoretical mechanisms or constructs that are represented by the independent variables. The epidemiological method examines the rates of occurrence of abnormal behavior in various population groups or settings. Evidence of how disorders cluster in certain groups or geographic areas may reveal underlying causes. Epidemiological researchers may use surveys and questionnaires as their preferred method of study. They investigate the incidence of the behavior, the prevalence of the behavior, all while using random samples of participants to complete the surveys. Kinship studies attempt to disentangle the contribution of environments and heredity. This would be twin studies and adoptive studies. If a monozygotic or identical twins are born and one develops schizophrenia, will the other? If they are separated at birth by adoption and one develops schizophrenia, does the other even though they grow up with no contact from one another? There is a 50% chance that the other identical twin does, which is shown using kinship studies. Case study methods can provide a richness of clinical material, but they are limited by difficulties of obtaining accurate and unbiased client histories, by possible therapist biases, and by the lack of control groups. Single case experimental designs are intended to help researchers overcome some of the limitations of the case study method. And this wraps up the first lecture for abnormal psychology. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see y'all in class.